Now, by the end of this lesson, you will be able to use positive, comparative, and superlative degrees of comparison in the correct forms. You will also become familiar with exceptions to the above forms. And you will be able to use intensifiers and mitigators for each degree of comparison. But first, as usual, let's have a look at your challenge from the previous lesson. In lesson 4, you were challenged to practice your passive voice. You had to convert the following sentences into passive voice. Jane will call Alex. Zara has cut the cake. And Ali is creating a spreadsheet. I will now go over each sentence with you step by step, and you can compare your answers to see how close you got to the correct answers. So, first up, we've got Jane will call Alex. In the active form, we've got our subject Jane, our verb in future simple tense will call, and our object Alex. Let's have a look at how this verb changes in the passive form. So, we know that to convert a sentence into passive voice, the order of the sentence changes to object, verb, subject. So, here's the passive sentence. Alex will be called by Jane. So, we've got our object, Alex, our verb, will be called, and our subject by Jane. So as you can see, the verb changes from will call to will be called. And we added the word by to the subject to show that Jane is the doer, even though the word Jane is at the end of the sentence. Great. Next we have Zara has cut the cake. In the active form, we've got our subject, Zara, our verb in present perfect tense, has cut, and our object, the cake. Let's have a look at how the verb changes in present perfect tense in the passive form. Now, we need an object, a verb, and a subject. So, here's the passive sentence. The cake has been cut by Zara. So, as you can see, the verb changes from has cut to has been cut. And we've got our object, our verb, and our subject that have been swapped around. Now, cut is an irregular verb. So that's why it behaves a little differently to what you're used to. Lastly, we have Ali is creating a spreadsheet. We've got our subject, Ali, our verb is creating, and our object, a spreadsheet. Now, let's have a look at how the present continuous tense verb changes in passive form. So, here's the sentence. A spreadsheet is being created by Ali. So, as you can see, there's our object, a spreadsheet, our verb is being created, and our subject by Ali. The verb changes from is creating to is being created. Before we start, I do want to familiarize you with the 3 degrees of comparison. Don't worry about the meaning of each word yet. I just want you to be familiar with the words so that you can understand later in the lesson how everything fits together. So there are 3 degrees of comparison: positive, comparative, and superlative. Got it? All right. So let's dive straight into this lesson and start off with something called the positive degree of comparison. I want you to have a look at this woman. Her name is Sarah. Observe everything about her. How would you describe her? Do you remember what we call the part of speech that describes things and people? Adjectives. So, let's think of some adjectives. How would you describe Sarah's hair? It's quite long, isn't it? What about the color of her hair? Is her hair light or is it dark? It's quite light. How about her eyes? Her eyes are quite light as well. Now, what else do you see? I can see that her nails are red. Her skin is quite pale too, meaning that she has a light skin tone. Now, I have some news for you. These adjectives are already in the positive form of the degrees of comparison. So the positive form is simply the base form of the adjective. There's not much you need to learn about the positive degree of comparison because you already know it. It's just a basic adjective. Okay, now it's time to make some sentences with these adjectives. How can you make a sentence about Sarah's hair? You can say, Sarah's hair is long and light. That's just one sentence form. There are many, many other ways you can convey the same meaning. Now, how can we make a sentence about Sarah's eyes? Well, we can say, Sarah has light eyes. Okay, now let's make a sentence about her nails. Sarah's nails are red. Remember, we also mentioned Sarah's skin tone. Sarah is pale. Okay, great. So now that we're on the same page about the basics of adjectives, we can now talk about intensifiers. Now, intensifiers are words that add emphasis to adjectives. The only way I can properly explain it to you is by showing you, because you're probably already aware of these words. The intensifiers in the following sentences are written in pink. Sarah's hair is quite long and super light. Here I want to describe that Sarah's hair is not only a little bit long and slightly light, it's quite long and it's super light. I want to intensify the adjectives because I want these descriptions to show extremity. Something else you can say is, Sarah has really light eyes. I used the intensifier really because I want the description of her light eyes to be emphasized. The word really is a really common intensifier. See what I did there? Okay, next you can say, Sarah's nails are very red. I say this because I don't think her nails are only a little bit red. They are very red, and I want to emphasize that description. You can also say, Sarah is extremely pale. Now, if I thought that Sarah was really, really pale, I'd use the intensifier extremely. As you can see, the intensifier is placed before the adjective. Do you see how intensifiers add emphasis to the adjectives? Now, it's important to note that we use different intensifiers for different degrees of comparison. In the next two core topics, you'll learn about the two other degrees of comparison. And I want to make sure you don't use the intensifiers you just learned for the other degrees of comparison. These intensifiers are only for the positive form. Here are some more examples of intensifiers you can use for the positive form. Too big. You can use the intensifier too when something is over a certain limit. For example, when your feet are too big to fit into certain shoes. Absolutely amazing. Utterly incredible. Highly intelligent. So great. These last four intensifiers are all intensifiers that generally just emphasize the adjective. Great, so now that you've learned about intensifiers, it's time to uncover the opposite of intensifiers, mitigators. Mitigators are words that make adjectives weaker. Let's look at some examples with our descriptions of Sarah. Sarah's hair is fairly long and rather light. The mitigators fairly and rather make the adjectives weaker, and as a result, it's clear that Sarah's hair is long and light, but not that long and light. Sarah has pretty light eyes. The mitigator pretty shows that Sarah's eyes are light, but it's nothing to write home about. We can say that the mitigator downplays the adjective. Sarah's nails are fairly red. Her nails aren't bright red, but I suppose they do slightly resemble the color red, so they're only fairly red. Sarah is a little pale. To be fair, Sarah isn't that pale. She does have a little bit of color in her skin, but her skin is generally quite light, and therefore we can say that Sarah is a little pale. Now I want you to take note again that like intensifiers, there are also different mitigators for each degree of comparison. So make sure you only use these mitigators for the positive form. Here are some more examples of mitigators that you can use for the positive form. A bit soft, a little long, and slightly annoying. Here's a quick politeness tip for you. Mitigators can make you sound more polite. For example, if your neighbor is playing very loud music in the middle of the night and you would like them to turn the volume down, you can politely say to them, "Your music is a little loud. Please turn it down." The use of the mitigator a little makes your complaint seem a little more polite. Without the mitigator, you would probably come across as quite angry and rude. Another example is if your friend has kindly made you some coffee, but it's too strong and bitter and you're really struggling to drink it. If you must mention it to your friend, you can say, "This coffee is a bit too strong." Remember, too is an intensifier. If you used only the intensifier too and no mitigator and said, "This coffee is too strong," you would come across as quite rude. So using a mitigator like a bit is definitely a good idea in this instance. Do you know what time it is? It's trivia time. Is the word in pink an intensifier or a mitigator? I'm very happy to see you here today. It's an intensifier. The word very emphasizes the adjective happy. Now that you've learned about the positive form and the intensifiers and mitigators you can use for the positive form, it's time to move on to the comparative form. In the last core topic, you had to describe Sarah. Now it's time to compare. You remember Sarah. Now meet Kelly. Do Sarah and Kelly look similar or different? Well, they have some things in common, but they have many differences between them as well. Let's use some adjectives to show the differences. We can start by talking about Sarah and Kelly's hair. We already mentioned that Sarah has light and long hair. On the other hand, Kelly seems to have dark and short hair. To be fair, Kelly's hair isn't very dark, but compared to Sarah, Kelly's hair is quite dark. Remember, we're doing a comparison. Now let's talk about Sarah and Kelly's skin. We've already mentioned that Sarah has slightly pale skin, and I used the mitigator slightly there to make it clear that Sarah's skin isn't that pale, but it is a little bit pale. Kelly is also pale, but probably more so than Sarah. Now let's talk about Sarah and Kelly's eyes. It seems like Kelly has rather dark eyes, while we've already mentioned that Sarah has light eyes. And I've used the mitigator rather to talk about Kelly's eyes, because her eyes aren't extremely dark, but they definitely are dark compared to Sarah's eyes. Okay, now let's go ahead and make some sentences. Take a moment to fill in the blanks. In the first sentence, we can say Sarah's hair is longer than Kelly's hair. Okay, and in the second sentence, we can say Kelly's eyes are darker than Sarah's eyes. And in the third sentence, we can say Kelly is paler than Sarah. Great. So note that the words we just inserted into these sentences are the comparative forms. Comparatives are the second degree of comparison. Can you see what we've added to the adjectives to put them in comparative form? We've added the letters ER, and this is usually the defining feature of the comparative form, though there are exceptions which we will talk about later in this lesson. But generally, the letters ER are added to the end of an adjective in comparative form, like in longer, lighter, paler, and darker. Now it's practice time. What are the correct forms of the words in brackets? Samuel is smart than Adam. Adam is strong than Samuel. Samuel is tall than Adam. The correct answers are smarter, stronger, and taller. As you can see, you simply add the letters ER to the end of the adjectives. Usually, you'd also use the word than after a comparative form to connect the two people or objects that are being compared. Now it's time to discuss intensifiers again. Remember, each intensifier is different for each degree of comparison. So now you will learn some intensifiers you can use for adjectives that are in the comparative form. You can say, Sarah's hair is much longer than Kelly's hair. The intensifier much emphasizes the fact that Sarah's hair is longer than Kelly's hair. It creates the impression that there is a very big difference between their hair lengths. Kelly's eyes are far darker than Sarah's eyes. Again, the intensifier far shows that there is a huge difference between Sarah and Kelly's eyes. Kelly is way paler than Sarah. Same as the other intensifiers, way shows that the difference in skin tone is large. However, using way as an intensifier is rather informal, so try not to use it in formal writing. Let's look at some more examples of intensifiers for the comparative form. A lot bigger, a great deal quieter, a good bit faster. These all mean more or less the same thing. They simply serve to emphasize the difference between two objects or people by emphasizing the comparative adjective. Let's now look at some mitigators. We will now look at some examples of mitigators you can use for the comparative form. Sarah's hair is a little longer than Kelly's hair. Kelly's eyes are slightly darker than Sarah's eyes. Kelly is a bit paler than Sarah. All these mitigators show that there are differences between Sarah and Kelly, but they are small and minor. Now it's trivia time. Is the word in pink an intensifier or mitigator? My house is significantly smaller than your house. It's an intensifier. This is an intensifier I haven't taught you. It serves to emphasize the difference between the house sizes. In Lesson 6, you are going to learn how to tell someone what someone else said. In other words, you will learn all about direct and reported speech in all the different tenses. This will help you with your writing and speaking skills. Apart from IELTS, you will be able to use this skill in your everyday conversations as well as in written forms such as emails and texting. So I look forward to seeing you at the next lesson. Now we can move on to our last degree of comparison, the superlative form. Let's go ahead and compare people again. You know Sarah already. You also know Kelly. Now meet Josh. Take a moment to look at how they are all different from one another. Look at everyone's hair length, their skin tones, their eye colors, and so on. What differences do you see? Let's start with the hair. We've already mentioned that Sarah has light and long hair. Kelly, on the other hand, has slightly darker hair, and her hair is also rather short. Josh's hair is very dark and shorter than both Kelly and Sarah's hair. Now let's talk about skin tone. Sarah is slightly pale. Kelly, as we know, is paler than Sarah. Josh's skin is darker than both Kelly and Sarah's skin. Now let's talk about the eyes. We know that Sarah has light eyes. Kelly has rather dark eyes, and we use the mitigator rather to show that her eyes are dark, but they're not that dark. Now Josh has much darker eyes than the rest of the people. Alright, so let's go have a look at some example sentences. Take a moment to think about what you might be able to fill in the blanks here. Alright, let's start with our first sentence. Sarah has the longest hair. So what I've done here is I've added the word the to the beginning, and I added the letters EST to the end of the adjective. Next, we have Josh's eyes are the darkest. So I've done the same thing. I've added the word the before the adjective, and I added the letters EST to the end of the adjective. Let's look at the last sentence. Kelly is the palest. I've done the same thing. I've added the word the and the letters EST. All right, so note that the words we just inserted into these sentences are the superlative forms. So you have just learned the superlative form. Well done. Superlatives are the third degree of comparison. It shows that something is the most extreme. Can you see what we've added to the adjectives to put them into superlative form? We've added the word the to the beginning, and we've added the letters EST to the end of the adjectives. And this is usually the defining feature of the superlative form, though of course there are exceptions which we will talk about very soon. But generally the letters EST are added to the end of an adjective in the superlative form, like in the longest, the lightest, the palest, and the darkest. Now it's practice time. Fill in the blanks. Let's start with this sentence. I'll give you a few seconds to read it and think about it. The correct answer is Samuel is the smartest person out of everyone in his class. Great. Now let's move on to the next sentence. I'll give you a few seconds. The correct answer is Kathy is the strongest athlete in the competition. Awesome. Okay, one more. Take a few seconds again. The correct answer is Adam is the tallest person I've met. Now it's time to talk about intensifiers again. This time we'll discuss intensifiers for the superlative form. Here are some intensifiers you can use. Sarah has by far the longest hair. Josh's eyes are easily the darkest. These intensifiers show that there is a very, very big contrast. Now, as I'm sure you're already aware, English has a lot of exceptions. Now, degrees of comparison are no different. There are some exceptions you need to take note of. First, there are some irregular adjectives. Then you need to note that two-syllable adjectives usually follow the rules you've learned, but there are some exceptions. Lastly, you need to note that three-syllable adjectives do not follow the same rules. So let's expand on all of this. Irregular adjectives are adjectives that don't follow the same rules as you've learned in this lesson. Some very common examples are good, which is the positive form, better, which is the comparative form, and the best, which is superlative. Then we have bad, worse, the worst, much, more, the most, far, further or farther, the furthest, the farthest. You simply need to memorize these as they don't follow any logical structure. Now, do you remember syllables? Syllables are the beats of words. An example of a two-syllable word would be crazy. Two-syllable words usually follow the rules you've learned, but there are some exceptions, such as tangled, more tangled, the most tangled, and polite, more polite, the most polite. As you can see, in these exceptions, we don't add ER or EST, and we use the words more or most. It's best to learn the correct forms, but if you are ever unsure of whether a two-syllable word follows the usual rules, rather use more for comparative forms and the most for superlative forms, just to be safe. But like I said, it's best to learn the correct forms. Adjectives with 3 or more syllables never follow the rules you've learned. For example, successful, you can hear, has 3 syllables, and it's successful, more successful, the most successful. It's alarming, more alarming, the most alarming. Attractive, more attractive, the most attractive. So this is the rule for all 3 or more syllable adjectives. Okay, now before we end off today's lesson, I want to do a quick recap of spelling rules. Remember Module 1, Lesson 2, where you learned about spelling rules? Well, do you remember learning about double consonants when adding suffixes? Okay, let's take a step back first. Do you remember what a suffix is? Suffixes are letters that you add to the end of a word to change the meaning slightly. Some examples include ER and EST that you learned about today. Now, do you remember what happens when you add a suffix to a word that ends in Y? Well, the Y needs to change to an I. For example, let's take the word happy, which is an adjective that ends in Y. If you want to change it to comparative or superlative form, you'd have to add the suffix ER or EST. So, the letter Y at the end of the word needs to change to I before you can add either of these suffixes. Now, sometimes when you add a suffix to the end of a word that ends in a consonant, the consonant at the end of the base word doubles, such as in the words fatter and fattest. As you can see, the consonant T at the end of the word doubles because the suffix ER or EST has been added. However, sometimes the consonant doesn't double, such as in pinker to pinkest. I wish I could teach you a quick rule now, but you might remember from Module 1, Lesson 2 that it's a bit more complicated than that. Lots of factors play a role in whether or not the consonant should double. If you're unsure, I recommend referring back to the Module 1, Lesson 2 summary notes, which contain a handy flowchart that explains when to double the consonant. Now for this lesson's challenge, I want you to do the following. Using the correct form and spelling, convert the following adjectives into comparative and superlative forms: crazy, intelligent, and good. This challenge will help you practice your spelling, form, and familiarity with exceptions.